there was a fancy dress. I can remember the fancy dress, and I can remember we all got either a cup or a mug from either school or the church, and we came, if it was raining, then we were to come into the church.
And we didn't have a telly, so we'd listen to it on the radio. And then about a couple of weeks after, I went to the Tyne Theatre. It was called the News Theatre then on Northumberland Street, wasn't it? And I watched it there, I watched the coronation there.
We didn't have a television, and neither did my parents, but my parents' neighbour had a television, and we all trooped into Mr. Murray's house and watched it on what I know now to be a very small black and white screen. But it was such a thrill to think that was all happening in London, and here we were in Gateshead watching it. And I'll never forget the Queen's beautiful smile. And then we got a close-up of her dress with all the sort of emblems of the British Isles on it. And I know it's something I will never forget, and I felt very lucky to have been able to see it.
The lady across the road, she did organise a kind of a street party, but it was rather a damp day, so we had to have it in the house. And this lady had the children in her house, and the adults went into somebody else's house. And I can always remember that this little boy, he threw some food across at the other ones, and it went and hit our wallpaper, and it rolled down our wallpaper. And of course nobody let on. She never noticed it for ages after, and every time after that, when I used to go in a house, I used to see this mark on the wallpaper and think that was our coronation tea that we had.
And when we went back to school, we all went to the cinema to see it on the screen in Technicolor, the coronation itself.
We went down to London and watched the coronation, standing on I think it was Muswell Hill, waiting for the Queen to come past. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon, pouring with rain, absolutely lashing down. And everybody had used newspapers to cover their hair and their bodies and things like that. And when we come to move away from there, it was a good job we had wellies on, because it was that thick in newspapers.
And the film at the time was 7 Brides for 7 Brothers, which my dad took me to as a special treat. So that was the coronation.
Looking back on the Queen's Jubilee, she's a very elegant, personable lady. She's been an excellent religious example. She's been a good mother, grandmother, a good great-grandmother. And even when her family have had little modern-day oopses, she's coped with it with good grace, and I have every respect for her. She deserves congratulations.
On Saturday, the 30th of July 1966, when England won the Football World Cup, I was driving my new-to-me Austin A40 Farina. I had passed my driving test on the 4th of July in the driving test centre in Chapelfield, Norwich. This is my second time of trying. It was in a new Vauxhall Viva, only a few days old. And I hadn't even done a reverse in it until we reached the test centre yard. During the test, the examiner stopped me and told me that he was going to get me to do an emergency stop. He explained that when he put his papers down in his hand on his knees, I was to stop immediately. As I was changing up from second to third at the time, I braked sharply. But this was a new car, as I said, and the brakes were good. As I suddenly stopped, he jerked forward sharply, then said, "I shall not require you to do that again."
In 1967 autumn, I was 18, and I had just arrived at Newcastle University. The late 60s were interesting in various ways, and one of the developments of this time was the increasing protest of black people about their unfair conditions. I followed events in apartheid South Africa when I was at school, and also the struggle for civil rights in America. That autumn, the university invited Martin Luther King, the American civil rights leader, to be given an honorary Doctor of Law degree. Apparently, he was keen to come because it was a break from the pressures that he was under in the US. I was amazed to find out that he was visiting and went to the lecture hall to see him arrive. I was asked if I wanted to come in to watch him speak and the rest of the ceremony. The speech that he made was absolutely spellbinding. I had never heard anyone speak so powerfully before. I can still remember seeing him and the effect that he had on me. The following spring, when Martin Luther King was shot, I felt profound sadness and shock that this should have happened to such an outstanding man and impressive individual.
I remember staying up all night one night with regard to a special occasion. It was the lunar moon landing. It had been in the news for absolutely weeks, and I'd been watching it and reading it, and that night it was about to happen. So we stayed up, my brother and I, particularly with my parents, and I was a teenager, and it was a big do, staying up all night. And we watched, and I look back at them now and see the images that we watched, which were fantastic. And they're all a blur and a little bit misty. And you think, oh, we were so impressed. But we were impressed. It was phenomenal that people had gone to the moon. And there they were, climbing down those steps. And that famous phrase that just expressed one small leap for man and a major leap for mankind.
Baby boomers, those like me born after World War II, experienced a massive cultural shift when the Beatles became popular in the early 1960s. As teenagers, we were guided by these new cultural stars. For example, when they grew their hair long, so did we. Typically, one of the Beatles would be your favourite of the four. For me, it was John Lennon. 1980, the year of Lennon's death, started for me in New Zealand. Our round-the-world travels then continued in South America. We'd wanted to be back in the UK for Christmas, and that December the cheapest way home from Brazil was to fly to New York and from there with Freddie Laker back to Heathrow. We had pre-arranged to spend a few days with an American friend in Manhattan while waiting to get a ticket on a flight back to London. I already knew that Lennon and Ono lived in the Dakota building on Central Park, but before arriving in New York, I'd had no intention of going to see the building. I was no autograph collector. On our first morning in New York, we turned on the radio and heard a series of John Lennon songs being played without interruption. When the radio announcer finally came on, he spoke in a somber voice mentioning the shooting death of Lennon during the night. We were suddenly in total shock and got up, feeling in a complete daze. We had originally planned to take it easy that day after months of continuous travel, but without making any sort of plan, we left the flat and eventually found ourselves in Central Park outside the Dakota with thousands of other sad and shocked-looking people. People were not speaking to each other. It was a sort of eerie quietness, but Lennon songs were being played from a loudspeaker somewhere. We didn't stay for long, but I felt that as we were there in New York when he died, that we should pay our last respects to him. Germany had been left split into two parts at the end of the Second World War. Russia created communist East Germany, and the Allies created West Germany. I spent 8 years living in West Germany during the 70s and 80s. My German friends often spoke about their dream of a reunited Germany. This was an exciting subject, and voices would be raised and tempers would start to fray. But they all accepted, without any doubt, that one day Germany would be reunited. I finally got to see East Germany in 1984, but I only travelled through from Berlin by train down to Prague in the then Czechoslovakia. What I saw shocked me. The East German teenagers on the train were dressed in parka jackets, just like I had when I'd been their age. They spent the whole night drinking and partying. The older East Germans sat in silence and simply accepted the noise from the youth. There was no aggression between the two age groups. If this had occurred in the West, then the older travellers would have got very annoyed and called the guard. This made me feel that it would be nearly impossible to peaceably reunite Germany as the cultures were poles apart. By 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down, I was living in Sydney, Australia. I watched the news there in total disbelief when they showed pictures of the wall being broken down and people climbing over the wall, yet not being shot by the East German guards, and then of East and West Germans hugging each other. I called up German friends to speak briefly about this major happening. Just as back in the 70s, they took it in their stride, saying that they had simply been waiting with confidence that the wall would one day fall.
I remember it was a Sunday. It was the day when actually Nelson Mandela was set free from prison. I'd been sending Christmas cards through Amnesty International to him year after year, just to let him know that he wasn't forgotten. Many, many people did. But this day was the day when he was going to come out of prison. I was going off to a conference and I was waiting for a friend to come and pick me up. But it had been on television and I'd been watching it live and I was hoping I wouldn't miss it. And I didn't. Because when this man came from that prison, he didn't come out in a police car or an escort. He walked. And boy, that was very moving, just to see a man that had been locked away for 30 years, a freedom fighter, being set free.
I remember it was a Sunday morning and we were rushing around as a family to get ready to go to an early morning service for my nephew's water baptism. And because we were in a rush, we had no television, radio on or anything. We were focused on getting out. So finally we got into the church, bundled into the church, sat down, and the vicar came along and began to open the service. But he said that everything was in a bit of a shock because of Diana's death. And we didn't understand. We thought maybe this dear lady was someone in the congregation or something, until he mentioned that it was the Princess of Wales. And then the shock waves that went through the congregation were almost, you could almost feel them. Everybody was in like stunned. Obviously some had known, but I remember that so distinctly. And from then onwards, your landscape is completely changed. And we went back, absolutely in a different place to when we came, and obviously the rest is history. We found out all the news footage and so on and so forth. But she was a greatly, greatly loved lady, and it was something that nobody could ever have expected.
What do I remember about the millennium? It was of great excitement. There was lots of hype in the media and everything about it turning 1,000 years, that we probably won't see that for a very, very long time. Oh, maybe 1,000 years. But not that, but the excitement over whether technology will be able to cope with it, whether it would keep in step, and whether we'll have a huge crash in the computer systems. There was a lot of excitement over this being such a unique time that not many people would ever experience this, and there was a lot of celebration in lots of different places in different ways. I remember where I was. I was actually with some of my friends, not all of them, and we decided to go into Norwich, the city of Norwich, to watch all of the fireworks and be part of the celebration there. And when we got there, we were a little bit disappointed of what we could see and where to go, and so we decided actually it would be much more fun to be with others of our friends. And so we decided all of a sudden to change the plan and go over to our other friends in North Pickenham. And there we celebrated the 15 minutes together before the new year started, round a bonfire, singing and celebrating, and actually we saw some fireworks as well. And I remember that time, and it seems so far away now, and but it was a great time and lots of celebration.
I remember where I was when I heard about the Twin Towers. I, at the time, was working for a voluntary transport scheme. I was a paid coordinator of the scheme, so booking people to take people out in cars. I was at my desk opposite my colleague, and my manager was sitting in the corner at his bigger computer, and he actually had been watching the news and announced what had happened, and then showed us some footage and said, well, we might be going to war, he said, I might be called up, and which was a bit of a shock to me. The reason he may have gone to war was because he was ex-forces and was part of the Reserve Air Corps. So if we as the UK were called up to back up America, and as allies, we would have gone to help them out, really. So he thought we might have started World War III, which to me was quite a scary prospect, as both my parents and myself had been born during peaceful times. And it's only the recollections of my grandparents and their experiences during the Second World War that we'd have any idea of what war would have been like. And the weapons of war would have actually changed quite significantly from those times to the 2000s. So we could have been in a lot of hot water.
I remember where I was on the 9/11 episode. I was shopping just with my mum in the Mall in Norwich. I think it was Castle Mall actually, and I just remember going up the stairs, and actually I was just walking past the shop, and it had loads of TV screens in the window. It was a shop that was selling TVs. I can't remember which shop it was now, but as I looked, I couldn't believe what I was watching. I thought, this is a random programme to have, and all of the TVs were switched to it. And all I could remember was seeing like smoke and these big towers like collapsing, and people standing around going, what? I didn't think much of it, and so I carried on shopping, and then when I got home, I realised that I'd actually watched the Twin Towers collapsing. I thought it was just a random spoof, but actually it was reality, it was the news. So I was in quite a bit of shock from that, but I remember that clearly.
I was sitting in Perth, and I'd been planning this trip to Phuket for a while, and I turn on the TV, and I just see this rush of water take over Phuket Island. Everyone was trying to call you to see if you're alright, and I'm going there to visit you and my little brother George, and the phone lines aren't working, and then like we see this other wave, and you just see rushes of water and cars flying all over the place. And I'm thinking, that's the beach near Dad's house.
Yeah.
Dad goes on a walk in the mornings along that beach, and I can't get through, and I'm supposed to be flying to Phuket. I think it was that afternoon. I said to my mum, I was like, oh well, I don't know what to do. Should I go to Phuket or not? And she's like, well, of course you don't go. There's like just been a tsunami there. And I was like, well, I want to help. I haven't seen Dad in a year or something. So I went, and it was just like a war zone. It's quite surreal when you haven't seen. I don't think I've even seen a dead body before, and you all of a sudden seeing like thousands of them being bloated and pulled out underneath cars and stuff. I don't know if you remember, looked down on the beach. And there's this woman who's lost like her little kiosk, selling drinks, and she's running up, giving us the last two water bottles.
Yeah.
And more concerned about our well-being. Do you remember that?
Yeah. That was the amazing thing about the Thai people, is even though I had a huge house there, and I took a lot of people into the house to the second floor because we had no idea what was happening, but they were more concerned about me. Even though they lived in a shack and I lived in this big house, and as you say, people on the beach and stuff, they still were more concerned about you. Were you okay? And they just might have had family members die, etc. So we gave out money, and I don't know if you recall, we bought mattresses and blankets and stuff like that, and all my staff, Dan time, everybody hands on.
The way the Phuket island bounced back from that experience was inspiring.
Yeah, about 6 months I think, and then it all started to pick up again. So yeah, that was another one of those learning experiences which you don't want to have, but it showed you about what's really important in life, that human connection.
Well, I remember midsummer it was, August, and on the news there was a disaster that had occurred, a mining disaster. It was in Chile. I couldn't even think where Chile was, but it sounded awful that there were a whole lot of men trapped half a mile underground. And I couldn't help but really think, that is awful. That is absolutely awful. And on the news, it covered the story of what had happened, and they didn't think any of them were alive. And even if they could find a way of getting to them, they didn't know how long it would take. As it happened, it took 69 days, with the whole world leaning into it. Machines brought in from across the world, drilling holes. And I remember the day when there was a camera sent down and someone passed in front of it, and it was a pair of eyes, and there was life. And this was some 30 odd days in. First time they knew anyone was alive. And I remember staying up all the night when the final group were coming out of the mine, and the elation that I felt, let alone everybody else, as it was one by one coming out of this small capsule. And it was wonderful. I would encourage you, if you remember it, go and look at it again. It's on YouTube, Chilean Miners Rescue. I've seen it recently. It's wonderful what happened.
I remember the date very well. I remember our family being royalists. We decorated the room. We had bunting and we had high tea. We had beautiful cake and cups of tea, and we had friends round to watch us, and we all, well, they didn't watch us, but they watched the TV with us and watched this beautiful service and Kate's beautiful white dress and the trees as they walked down the aisles. And I remember the scripture that was read and how they would be servants, and how then I saw Kate and William holding hands, and that was a beautiful moment. It was so precious, and I was so overjoyed that we could join in at home and watch that special day.
Tell me the one about the virus again, then I'll go to bed.
But my boy, you're growing weary, sleepy thoughts about your head.
Please, that one's my favourite. I promise just once more.
Okay, snuggle down, my boy, though I know you know full well. The story starts before then, in a world I once would dwell. It was a world of waste and wonder, of poverty and plenty, back before we understood why hindsight's 2020. You see, the people came up with companies to trade across all lands, but they swelled and got much bigger than we ever could have planned. We'd always had our wants, but now it got so quick. You could have anything you dreamed of in a day, and with a click. We noticed families had stopped talking. That's not to say they never spoke, but the meaning must have melted, and the work-life balance broke. And the children's eyes grew squarer, and every toddler had a phone. They filtered out the imperfections, but amidst the noise, they felt alone. And every day the skies grew thicker, till you couldn't see the stars. So we flew in planes to find them, while down below we filled our cars. We'd drive around all day in circles. We'd forgotten how to run. We swapped the grass for tarmac, shrunk the parks till there were none. We filled the sea with plastic, because our waste was never capped, until each day when you went fishing you'd pull them out, already wrapped. And while we drank and smoked and gambled, our leaders taught us why. It's best to not upset the lobbies. More convenient to die. But then in 2020, a new virus came our way. The governments reacted and told us all to hide away. But while we all were hidden, amidst the fear and all the while, the people dusted off their instincts. They remembered how to smile. They started clapping to say thank you and calling up their mums. And while the car keys gathered dust, they would look forward to their runs. And with the skies less full of voyagers, the earth began to breathe, and the beaches bore new wildlife that scuttled off into the seas. Some people started dancing, some were singing, some were baking. We'd grown so used to bad news, but some good news was in the making. And so when we found the cure, and were allowed to go outside, we all preferred the world we found to the one we'd left behind. Old habits became extinct, and they made way for the new, and every simple act of kindness was now given its due.
But why did it take a virus to bring the people back together?
Well, sometimes you've got to get sick, my boy, before you start feeling better. Now lie down and dream of tomorrow, and all the things that we can do. And who knows, if you dream hard enough, maybe some of them will come true. We now call it the Great Realization. And yes, since then there have been many. But that's the story of how it started, and why hindsight's 2020.